Hey everyone, Delve here. Okay, so I already did the races tier list for Oblivion, and so now it's time to talk about the birthsigns. Again, this tier list will be strictly balanced around max difficulty, so these will be ranked in accordance with how powerful they are for that. The birthsign is something you get to choose during the tutorial or in character creation of some kind, and it just gives you some augment of some kind. It's just some free bonus you get basically, but you only get to pick one. It's the second choice you get to make in the game after your race, and it is actually decently impactful. The main problem with a lot of them is that some of them are pretty ineffectual, but some of them change the way you play so much that it's a really big deal. So it's a really mixed bag, and it is kind of interesting. First up is the Apprentice. This grants 100 points of Magicka and also 100% weakness to magic. 100 bonus points of Magicka is huge and can enable you to cast some very crazy spells, but 100% weakness to magic is unfortunately a very massive downside. The goal as you approach the end game is to be immune to magic in a lot of cases, not susceptible to it, because enemies will reflect spells, they'll hit you with spells, so depending on your character, there's lots and lots of really good reasons to not be weak to magic. With that being said, there are some strategies that don't really care too much about weakness to magic, but for everything except the cheesiest skills, that much weakness to magic is very intolerable. This makes even early game enemies like scamps and ghosts kind of dangerous, and these enemies can already be pretty tough to deal with. Now, if you get to the late game, you can circumvent this with sigil stone enchantments and other items, things that grant like spell reflection and spell absorption, but again, you'd basically have to use tons of cheesy skills to make it really possible to do anything. Although, it is important to note that 100 extra magicka is a lot of extra magicka, and so if you wanted to use skills that helped you get around these problems, that is a really great trade-off. So because of that, I don't think I can give this anything less than A tier. You can cast big, huge illusion spells and win that way. You can cast big, huge conjuration spells and win that way. You can kind of just do whatever you like in that respect. So it is A tier. Yes, it does have a very terrible drawback, but it does help enable some very crazy spellcasting. You just have to be prepared for a character essentially built around this birthsign. But if that's what you're going for, it is very good for that. Again, A tier. Next up is the Atronach. What this does is that it gives you 50% spell absorption and 150 extra points of magicka, but also gives you stunted magicka, which means your magicka doesn't regenerate over time. So the benefits are quite good. 50% spell absorption is halfway to spell immunity, except that you can't absorb spells that have been reflected by enemies. And 150 magicka points is also obviously pretty good as well. For the downside, there are ways around stunted magicka. You can use potions for one. Those can be pretty effective, and also a mysticism exploit. And of course, your own summons casting spells at you as well, you can absorb those. The problem with a lot of these methods of restoring magicka is that they aren't consistent until you get 100% spell absorption, which is kind of a late game thing. So you'll have to go through a huge chunk of the game where you really only get a coin flip at absorbing any given spell. So even though this looks like something that could be used as a spellcaster character, it really isn't practical in my opinion to play a spellcaster with Atronach. The real actual use for this is for a character who doesn't rely on magic at all. Warriors or thief type characters, as just an easy way to get halfway to spell immunity. In this respect, it is actually quite good and versatile because it absolutely helps enable characters who don't use magic, such as warriors. So it can actually open a decent number of doors for you and is a good alternative to the Breton race. So I can't give it anything less than an S tier, it's just too useful, just because it does very much enable a lot of things that would otherwise be frankly impossible or more difficult. And it is probably my most used birthsign overall as well, just because, again, it enables lots of, melee characters. It just goes to show how powerful the Breton race really is, and how incredibly powerful 50% resistance to magic is. Okay, next up is the Lady. 10 points to endurance and willpower. While I do deeply respect what this birthsign is trying to do, give you more health and magic regeneration, it's very weak. Yes, you could probably get away with this birthsign somehow. It's not actively detrimental to your character, but it's very tough to argue in favor of it relative to other birthsigns. The benefit that these stats gives you is negligible compared to some of the benefits these other birthsigns can get you, and I can't see what strategy this helps enable, if any at all. Unfortunately, it does have to go into D tier, possibly the single worst birthsign in the game. Okay, next up is the Lord. This gives you a lesser power that always costs 50 magicka and heals you for 6 points per second for 15 seconds, but it also gives you a 25% weakness to fire. Now, Restoration is actually a pretty tough skill to level, and this lesser power is equivalent to an expert level restoration skill. So it's actually really good. I haven't used this myself, but I can see how this basically makes you unkillable, assuming you had enough armor and magic resistance, so it's an interesting option for Breton, especially if you have the right kind of setup. It's definitely not perfect or anything like that, and it most certainly will not stop you from getting one-shot by some enemies or spells, so it's not really broadly useful or convenient for every type of character, and 50 magicka is a lot. Note that in the remaster, instead of this spell, it's 15 points of shield and 15 points of magic resistance, which is also pretty good actually. And so right out of the box, either of these versions of it can be used to make Breton really tough and hard to kill. I'd say both the original and the remaster are solid A tier. Both could definitely help enable certain kinds of characters, but again, you'd probably have to be kind of built around it. Next up is the Lady. This is 10 seconds of paralysis for the cost of 120 fatigue. It's only once per day, and plenty of enemies are immune to paralysis. And of course, you still need a way of dealing damage, so it's not as if it's bad, but I do also think that it isn't as broadly applicable as a lot of other Birthsigns, and it won't help you in scenarios with lots of enemies. But I can definitely see the potential. You could use the time to cast spells, you could swing a melee weapon, apply poisons to weapons. It actually probably could enable certain strategies, although I never actually have used it. You could of course stack it with other paralysis powers and spells too, so you're looking at 15 seconds of paralysis with greater powers alone. You could probably kill just about any enemy with that time. Unfortunately, needing a strategy to deal with paralysis immune enemies really hurts this. But I can absolutely think of ways to make it work. It's also on touch. That's another slight downside. I should also mention that if you're out of fatigue when you cast this, your character will be knocked unconscious on the ground and you won't be able to do anything. So you will have to play around that as well. But yeah, it's okay. Definitely very cool, for sure. But just slightly obtuse enough to lock it out of A tier, I think. Very high B tier, though. Okay, next is the Mage. Very simple, 50 points of bonus magicka. That's worth 25 points of intelligence, and you can still hit 100 intelligence. So in the long run, it is just free bonus magicka for essentially nothing. But even in the short run, this is completely insane. For some races, that's nearly doubling your magicka pool. And even for races like High Elf and Breton, you're still looking at 20 to 33% increase to your total magicka pool for literally no downsides. This enables all kinds of crazy spell casting, from damage spells to support spells. Whatever your character wants or needs, this is there for you. Even if your end goal is to have a huge amount of magicka, this just helps you get there with no real downsides. I would say that this is the strongest Birthsign in the game, especially on the Breton race. It's good early, it's good late. The only bad thing I can say about it is that it may not be the perfect Birthsign for every kind of strategy. But out of the box, support magic can even do a lot for melee or stealth-based characters as well. So it just never goes to waste, no matter what you're doing, as long as you are spending your magicka. The possibilities of this Birthsign are only limited to your imagination. That's just how good it is. Stack this with any amount of bonus magicka, from sigil stones or items like the Ring of Transmutation, and you can cast really strong spells, even at level 1, or just whenever. So the best Birthsign in the game, no question about it in my mind, easy S tier, top of S tier. Next is the Ritual. This grants 2 powers, a lesser power that is turn undead 25 points for 30 seconds on target, with a cost of 40 magicka, and then a restore health 200 points on self once per day. This is definitely super underrated. 25 points of turn undead is literally 100% of undead enemies, and because it's a power, it's not affected by skills or spell effectiveness. And a lot of undead enemies are pretty tough to deal with. The only downside is, of course, the 40 magicka point cost. So depending on your setup, it may not be efficient to be chain casting this at all. Also, fleeing enemies are kind of annoying, but there probably is some really specific use for this, or at least it's convenient for something somewhere. And then, of course, 200 points of healing. That's basically just a second health bar, depending on your level. So the right kind of setup, that's a good amount. Without the right kind of setup, it's probably not going to make a huge difference. So I'll give this C tier. Maybe you could find a use for this Birthsign, but honestly, it's just too niche and fringe to make any kind of meaningful cut, in my opinion. I can see the potential, but again, very fringe, very specific, and probably not as good as a lot of the other Birthsigns, like the Lord, for example, right? You want healing? Just go with the Lord, right? Why do you need 200 points once per day? But it's C tier. This is more useful than you might think, I think. Next up is the Serpent. 3 points of damage, health for 20 seconds on touch. Cures poison on self, dispels 90 points on self, and damages fatigue 100 points on self. So the best thing about this, I'd say, is the damage. It's actually not bad at all for a low-level character, especially if your character is struggling to deal damage. Relatively niche, and it isn't super compelling compared to other Birthsigns, but also certainly not useless. The Dispel itself is also fairly interesting, as 90 points is a lot. That's very difficult to get some other way, and probably could be used to knock off certain debuffs in fringe scenarios. Never something I've done, but maybe. I personally really like this Birthsign, but I can't deny that it is very niche, and really only provides damage for a low-level character. That's kind of all it does. But stacked with other powers, it's actually not so bad, so I'll give this solid B tier. It definitely opens up some stuff, hardly the best or the most useful, but the kind of thing that totally can be used in all kinds of scenarios if you have the right kind of setup. Next up is the Shadow. This is invisibility for 60 seconds once per day. Invisibility is obviously really powerful, and having this Birthsign means you just have one free use of invisibility. It can't solve every problem, and it's also very easy to get it out of potions and spells as well, so it's not really meaningful to take a greater power with it, I think. But I still think it's convenient. That just means you don't need a potion, or you don't need to be able to cast an illusion spell, right? As there are plenty of locations where being able to go invisible can bail you out, and you can stack a bunch of greater powers and get a lot of invisibility that way. It's very tough to justify relative to other Birthsigns, but also something you could very easily add to a stealth-based character, or really any character, with no real downside, and that'll just save you some gold, or save you some time, or something like that. So I think it is B tier. Okay, next is the Steed, and all it grants is 20 points of speed. As far as the stat increasing ones go, I think this is probably the best. There's definitely some kind of niche application for this in some kind of speedrun style scenario, even on max difficulty. Just load up on invisibility potions or spells, and then just skip everything as a high elf with the Steed sign. That's possible, probably. You'd still need ways to kill certain enemies, but there's ways to get that, obviously. So yeah, I'd say this is low B tier. I don't really care about speedrunning or going super fast or anything like that, but it does have a niche for sure, absolutely. And you potentially could find a way to make uses of it on a more conventional character too, just to help you move a little bit faster, I guess, if you wanted that. Okay, next we have the Thief. 10 points of agility, luck, and speed. Now, stats on the main are pretty poor, just all attributes in general, especially compared to some greater powers, and yet at the same time, they aren't useless. And obviously, as we just went over, speed in particular is kind of nice. Agility does a variety of things. It boosts your bow damage, and it also increases your fatigue and makes you less likely to get staggered in melee combat. Luck also gives you a bonus to all your skills for each point of luck over 50. For example, 10 points of luck, which is what this Birthsign gives, is worth about 4 skill points of value for all of your skills. Although luck cannot cause your skills to go above 100. Now, some free bonus skill points isn't too bad, right? Although I think for spellcasting, it doesn't really do that much. The general goal of any spellcaster is to basically hit 100 for any skill you are using, and then cast really powerful spells that way, and to rely really heavily on that one magic skill you're using, or those 1 or 2 magic skills you're using. So I think it doesn't really do much for a magic-oriented character. For a physically oriented character, it's not at all bad. Skills like Blade, Block, Blunt, Heavy, and Light Armor, these are all skills that are tough to level, so a slight bonus to these is really nice, although it won't activate any threshold perks, so this cannot be used to repair magic weapons and armor, like I already said, before you have an armor skill of 50. Unfortunately, giving yourself a small bonus to all of your skills probably just isn't that crazy, and is unlikely to make any serious difference anywhere, at least as far as I know. But I am sure you could make it work. It's not like this is useless or anything. I think C tier is fine, as it might slightly boost certain specific strategies, like some kind of sneak-based character, or even like a melee character, weirdly. So, C tier. Okay, next is the Tower. This gives you a power to open an average or lower lock once per day, and also another power that grants a very small amount of reflect damage once per day, 5%. Both of these are kind of poor. Opening a lock is convenient and nothing else, since that can be achieved very easily at 50 alteration, or just by understanding the lockpicking minigame and having enough lockpicks, even if you have essentially no security skill. It is convenient though, so I do have to give it that. I like that. The reflect damage power is also largely useless. It does reduce melee physical damage by 5%, but it is also affected by the difficulty modifier, so enemies will only take 1/6 of their own damage back, making it kind of poor overall. This Birthsign does have very specific fringe uses, however, that being if you are trying to use reflected damage to beat the game, as otherwise it is quite difficult to get reflect damage as an effect for custom spells. So that is really cool, and I enjoyed using this Birthsign immensely. I think mid-C tier is fine, only useful in one very specific situation, but it does have a use, which I really like. and it's good for something, which is more than can be said for a lot of birth signs. And lastly, we have the warrior. It is plus 10 endurance and plus 10 strength. 10 endurance means more health, and you also gain more health per level as well. Strength increases your melee damage and also gives you carry weight. So 10 strength equates to 50 points of carry weight, which is quite convenient. On paper, this seems very fine, decent even, but in practice, I think it does essentially nothing, and is very nearly as bad as the Lady Birthsign. The actual amount of melee damage you are gaining is rarely, if ever, enough to make the difference. Same with the extra health. I think for a melee-oriented character in particular, it probably isn't enough to be meaningful in almost any situation. I think it is way better than the Lady, purely by virtue of the fact that it comes with 50 extra points of carry weight, which might be okay-ish if you were carrying around a lot of weapons and armor. But it is, in my opinion, outclassed by many other birth signs, and doesn't even have its own unique use or niche, unlike most other birth signs. Very much D tier. Very, very D tier. Okay, and that's the birth sign tier list. S tier is for birth signs that are broadly useful and absurdly powerful. A tier is for ones with strong effects that probably could help or enable some strategies. B tier is for the decent birth signs that can at least be useful, I guess, or can help some strategies. C tier is for extremely niche birth signs, but that could potentially be valuable for certain types of characters. And D tier are fine, but they don't really do very much, and are generally outclassed by essentially all the other birth signs. It is important to understand that even more so than race, birth signs can help enable or help many very specific strategies work. So it may be about as important, if not more, depending on what strategy you intend to use. So definitely I think the gap between the D tier and like the A and the S tier birth signs is really massive. It's really, really, really huge. The higher you go up in this tier, the more value you're going to get out of your birth sign if you're doing it correctly. And the lower you go on this list, the less value you're going to get out of the birth sign by a really tremendous amount. So S is like 100 times more useful than D or something silly like that, right? Lastly, I'd like to give a special shout out to the Old Knight, as well as the UASP and fandom wikis. Without these sources, none of this would be possible. So thank you. And also thank you for watching.